Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you a double book review of two books that I think will appeal to people who are interested in various sorts of historical fantasy. These are both October 2017 releases, so new this month. They are both standalone novels, and they are both things that I got digital review copies of via NetGalley. They are also both books that I enjoyed quite a lot, but for very different reasons, and I gave both of them 4-star reviews. The first of these books that I'm going to talk about is the one that was most recently released. This was released yesterday as I am filming this on October 24th, and this is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. And the second book that I'm going to talk about was released earlier this month on October 3rd, and that is Under the Pendulum Sun by Jeannette. So the first of these books, The Beautiful Ones, is a fantasy of manners following a sort of 2-act structure, following a set of characters over the course of 2 consecutive grand seasons in a fictional city that I don't really know how to pronounce the name of, but I'm going to guess that it's something like Loisel. There is a bit of magic in this book, but since it's primarily used in the course of the story to highlight the characters' personal struggles, it may help if you go into this book thinking of the setting as you might a non-magical fantasy world with a historical basis. In this case, I believe the historical inspiration is the Belle Epoque, so like turn of the 20th century France. It's almost entirely high society romance fluff, but it totally hooked me and I couldn't put it down until it was over, so it gets a lot of points from me for that. Act 1, as I think of it, sets up a tightly constructed love triangle between the 3 main characters of the book. Hector is an acclaimed telekinetic performer recently returned to his country of origin after years abroad. He comes from a lower-class background but has earned considerable wealth and status. We learn that years ago he was engaged to be married to character number 2, Valerie Beaulieu, a lady from an aristocratic family fallen on hard times. At a young and impressionable age, with the weight of her family's future on her shoulders, she broke her secret engagement with Hector in order to marry for money. Since then, she has become a dominant figure in fashionable circles into which she has been charged with introducing character number 3, Mina Beaulieu, short for Antonina, a young cousin of Valerie's husband's, sent to Loisel from the family's estate in the country with the hopes that she will find a husband during the grand season. Mina is a gauche but genuine young character. She is an amateur entomology enthusiast and also a telekinetic with very little control over her unladylike powers. Valerie is really over-controlling of Mina, whom she sees as this country bumpkin who is unworthy of the good fortune of her family circumstances. But when Mina meets Hector, who as you'll recall is a fellow telekinetic, she feels like she may have met a kindred spirit. Hector, on the other hand, begins to formally court Mina with the vague and obviously ill-considered notion of propelling himself back into Valerie's orbit. Predictably, Mina falls for Hector, who somehow failed to see this coming, blinded by his years-long obsession with proving himself to Valerie. And so, to sum it up, the first half of the story is a clear recipe for, disaster and heartbreak all around. Of Act 2, I can obviously say very little except that a second courtship triangle forms with slightly different component parts from the first, and the central characters are all pressed to reveal either their best or in some cases their worst selves. I thought that Mina's growth as a character from the first half to the second was particularly lovely. So this is a book for readers who enjoy stories of complicated courtships with historical trappings. I'm gonna tell you straight out, it's not gonna be for readers who are fundamentally averse to the use of love triangles. There are 2 of them, although they are of the formal courtship variety and not the teen angst sort you get in a lot of YA novels and such. There's nothing earth-shattering in this story, no political intrigue or world-changing events like fantasy readers are sometimes conditioned to expect. Just people making a mess of things and then having to deal with it. I found it wonderfully escapist. This was the first of Silvia Moreno-Garcia's books that I've read. I have heard very high praise for her previous novels, Signal to Noise and Certain Dark Things. I think all three of these books are in really different, like, subgenres of fantasy. I think where I want to go with her writing next is probably Signal to Noise, because that one is magical realism and I'm interested in that. Regardless, it seems like she's a very versatile author and I'm looking forward to reading more of her stuff. The second book I'm going to talk about here, Under the Pendulum Sun, is a little harder to talk about just because it's way more dense in ideas. This is a book you may be interested in if you're looking for something to sit with for a while and wrap your mind around. It's a dark psychological fantasy in a gothic vein, paying considerable literary homage to authors such as the Brontes. This is Jeannette Ng's debut novel, and impressively she manages to keep it really grounded in historical reality, despite the fact that it takes place entirely in the Feylands. She accomplishes this by immersing us in the mindset of her characters, who are Victorian missionaries. And this Victorian missionary mindset is clearly something that she's researched in great detail. To a modern fantasy reader, the idea of converting the Fae to Christianity is like obvious and absurd folly. But to the protagonist Catherine Helstone and her brother Lon, it's just the natural course of action. Since childhood, they've dreamed of adventure in distant lands, and for products of their time and place in history, such adventure is inexorably tied to this notion of the salvation of the heathens. So what more thrilling a country could there be to venture to than fairyland? And what nobler place could there be to spread the word of God? And yes, it does go rather poorly for them, but not necessarily in precisely the ways you would expect given that premise. In this alternate history, the English have established trade with the Fey country known as Arcadia, or alternatively at times referred to as Elfane, at whose shores one can only arrive by getting lost. The sun here is literally a lantern on a pendulum, and the moon is a fish that swims through the sky. Constant reminders that this is a land unlike any other known to humankind. The story begins with Kathy's arrival in Arcadia, desperate for news of her missionary brother, and certain that he needs her help. She finds, to her dismay, that her brother's mission is in a remote and near-deserted castle with no access to the local population, that her brother isn't there, that no one will tell her where he is, and that she is not allowed to leave. So much for adventure. All Kathy can do is knit and make small talk with her changeling guide, Miss Davenport, field theological questions that she can't answer from the mission's sole convert, a gnome named Mr. Benjamin, and wonder what happened to cause her brother, once her ally and professed equal in all things, to abandon her to an empty and unfulfilling woman's existence in England. But the castle also holds a mystery that puzzles her. What happened to the previous missionary, Reverend Roach? Is the answer in the papers Kathy discovers, written in a language that she can't decipher? Or in Roach's journal, which she has been instructed not to read? In many ways, this seems like a contradiction of a book. Set in a rich fantasy land, but with the action contained almost entirely to a single locale, centering on characters who are incapable of questioning either the existence of their god or the existence of the fey magic that surrounds them. The first portion of the book is incredibly slow-moving, and while the pace picks up somewhat after Lon's arrival, followed by that of the Fey Queen Mab, known as the Pale Queen, and her court, it never really ceases to be dense going. There's a lot to unpack here, and a lot of it relies heavily on complicated theology. I'm not a Christian and I never really studied religion, so I did a lot of Googling of things and rereading of passages, which is part of why it took me a kind of long time to read the book. Everything has to hinge on this question of Arcadia's place in God's creation, outside the bounds of the understood natural world as it is. What is the nature of the Fae and of their presumed souls? How might a human preach to them? And what is the point of parable in a world where everything is already in some way a story. These are just a few of the many questions posed within this book. But in addition to being theologically dense, I have to emphasize that Under the Pendulum Sun is one of the most genuinely creepy and haunting books that I've read in a really long time, which is why I'm glad that I read it in the month of October. Mab holds the keys to Inner Arcadia and has the power to grant access to the rest of the Feylands. But she is playing some serious mind games with her so-called pet missionary supplicant and his sister, and things get real frighteningly dark. Unsurprisingly, sin turns out to be a major theme as Arcadia contrives to test these mortals' convictions to their breaking points. I'll admit I went into this book sort of expecting a more pointed, modern critique of religious ideology and colonialism, but this isn't really a pointed sort of book. It's a book that gives you a lot to think on and then makes you do your own thinking. And having seen the whole story play out, I am satisfied with what it accomplishes. At times, this book did scratch the itch for literary fantasy, for lack of a better term, that I've been harboring ever since finishing Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. If you want to use that as a point of comparison, Ing's tone here is more brooding and less witty than Clark's. But both books share a rich sense of lived-in alternative history and an acute understanding of Fae folklore, both of which I personally really appreciate. Since finishing the book, I've been continuing to turn various plot points and ideas from it around in my mind, and I think I still have some questions that would require a reread to answer fully. I also know that there are some of the specifically theological arguments between the characters that I didn't fully follow, but there are a surprising number of twists, reveals, and reversals in this book, given that it's a nearly actionless and essentially idea-driven book. So overall, it's dark and moody, creepy fantasy, if that's something you're looking for. Now, there is some content in this book that is almost certainly a spoiler. And though I'm not usually one for spoiler reviews or spoiler sections of reviews, I don't feel totally comfortable omitting it altogether since it becomes a major part of the story, and I can imagine some readers feeling like they should have been given a heads up. I really just want to cover my bases here in case any of you pick up this book on my recommendation and it turns out to be something that you really do not want to read about. So if you absolutely want to avoid spoilers, you can leave this video now. Please comment, have a nice day, and all that. But if you think you might want to know more about the content of the book before deciding whether or not to pick it up, or if you've already read the book, feel free to stick around. Okay, are we all good? Okay, so about halfway through the book, Catherine's relationship with Long develops into a sexual one. Sin of various sorts, as I mentioned, being a theme here. So this is where I, as a reader and reviewer, am sort of on uncertain ground because I genuinely don't know how sensitive a subject sibling incest is for other readers. Like, I don't know how many people are going to see it as a taboo subject to be explored and challenged, or how many people are going to be upset by it and are maybe going to want to avoid the book because of that content. I'm an only child, I don't have any siblings, so like I didn't have a strong personal reaction to it aside from the fact that it is unsettling because it is unsettling for the characters and it's supposed to be in the context of the book. Regardless, these are the two main characters of the book, and their relationship is the central relationship of the book. So I felt like it needed to be mentioned in some way. Anyhow, that is really all. I hope you are having a nice day. Bye for now.